We're live.
All righty. Our first witness this morning is Eric Davis. Eric is here on Zoom. So Eric, please go ahead.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay?
No.
It could be a little louder.
Okay, I'll see what I can do here.
That's much better. That's much better.
That's better. Okay, all right. Good morning. For the record, my name is Eric Davis, and I'm the president of Gun Owners of Vermont. We are an all-volunteer, nonprofit advocacy group dedicated to the preservation of the right to keep and bear arms. And I appreciate the invitation to speak today regarding Bill H-230. The purported aim of this legislation is to reduce suicides in Vermont, and I'd first and foremost like to acknowledge that this is a serious issue which we do not take lightly. Chances are that everyone in this room has been affected by suicide in some way or another. In my small hometown in Northfield, I've personally known several people who were lost to suicide. One of these people was a friend of mine from high school who, after several attempts to take his own life, finally succeeded in doing so by jumping headfirst off a local bridge and into the Dog River below. It's a very tragic and painful experience when someone you know makes the decision to end their own life, and we sympathize with everyone who has been affected by this sort of tragedy. It's a very real problem, and we are cognizant of that. Even so, after considering this bill from a few different angles and the proposals contained therein, we remain skeptical that the intended goal is what the authors say it is, and not just another drive-by attempt at restricting access to guns, something that's become a bit of a crusade for some lawmakers in recent years. From a practical standpoint, we notice that this bill is very narrow in its focus. Suicide is a very complex and multi-layered issue with a plethora of contributing factors and conditions that lead up to the ultimate act of ending one's own life. Yet H-230 completely ignores any discussion of why people commit suicide and focuses on one single method of how people commit suicide: with a gun. The data from the Vermont Department of Health cites a chart from the Suicide Prevention Research Center, which lists reducing access to means as the last step in the approach to suicide prevention, yet it is the only step addressed in H-230, and guns are the only means with which they seek to restrict access. We have to ask why. Psychologists and psychiatrists alike assess whether a person is suicidal based on whether that person has a detailed plan to kill themselves and the means with which to carry out that action. Neither of these things by themselves is sufficient. It's very rare that a person commits suicide without first having made a plan and given a great deal of thought to the where, when, how, etc. Things like mandatory lockup requirements, ERPOs, and blanket waiting periods for all firearm sales not only miss the point, but also amounts to putting up roadblocks that the suicide has already circumvented. It is not a deterrent. The person still accomplishes their goal, if not now, then later. And those who are not truly suicidal do not die, also by their own choice. We've heard anecdotal evidence of only 2 suicides in the past 10 years where a person has used a firearm that was purchased the same day. We know of 0 instances involving a firearm that was purchased at a gun show, yet the waiting period provision in this bill uses these 2 extremely rare incidents to punish those who account for the tens of thousands of legitimate firearms acquisitions which occur in this state every year. Similarly, if the vast majority of suicides by firearm occur with a gun that was already in the home, it cannot be reasonably concluded that a mandate requiring guns to be kept locked and inoperable might have any discernible effect on someone who has already made a plan to end their life with a gun they already own. This could, however, have serious life-threatening implications for someone who needs to immediately access a firearm for self-defense, especially given the increase in the rate of violent crime some communities are currently experiencing. Considering these few things alone, we must conclude that this type of legislation will have vast and negative effects on law-abiding Vermonters by restricting their right to immediately access a gun for self-protection and cannot seriously be expected to have any practical impact on suicides. But in addition, we believe that there is also an underlying ethical question to which the best of our knowledge has not yet been addressed anywhere in the consideration of this bill. And before we dive into that discussion, I'd like to present a very quick summary of the standard accounting of the right to keep and bear arms as it's understood by those of us who work so hard to preserve it. First, each individual owns their life or has a right to their life. Second, the right to life by necessity implies that the individual has a right to protect or defend that life. Third, the right to defend one's life is an empty promise devoid of meaning if that right does not also encompass the right to acquire and keep the means with which to do so. Since the right to life implies a right to the means to protect oneself, it also necessarily implies a right to keep and bear arms suitable for self-defense. In modern practice, that means a firearm. And fourth, a government of a free people is instituted, as it says in the Declaration of Independence, only with the consent of the governed in order to secure each person's right to life. Such a government, therefore, must, of necessity, recognize the right of the people to keep and bear arms for self and common defense. Now, considering the implications of the proposed legislation in this respect, it leads us to ask a few questions. Does the value of your life depend on the rate of suicide or homicide or violent crime in any given geographical area? And if not, then should the legal right to obtain the means with which to defend your life be a function of the suicide or homicide or violent crime rate, so that the right comes into and goes out of existence as the rate rises or falls to a certain level? And if not, then should the value of your life and subsequently the right to access the means with which to defend it be determined by or contingent upon the rate at which others might use the same tools of self-defense for the purpose of self-harm? Now, I apologize if I come across as a bit obtuse here, but the underlying point is that neither the tragic case in the family of Representative Black nor the aggregate suicide data of any demographic provide a compelling ethical reason to put good people in danger by creating obstacles to acquiring a firearm for personal protection. Nor does it provide justification for forcing everyone to keep their guns locked, rendered inoperable, and functionally useless for the purpose of defending one's life inside their own home. This holds true regardless of how lopsided our theoretical equation of suicides prevented versus lives saved in self-defense might be. The choice must always remain with the individual, not the state. And as a final consideration, we must also look at the constitutional implications of such legislation. And here I'd refer anyone who's interested to my testimony submitted on March 1st to the House Judiciary Committee. I've linked it in this document here. At 2,700 words, it's a bit lengthy to recite verbatim, but I'd like to give a quick summary or the cliff notes, if you will. Gun control advocacy groups have disingenuously pointed to several examples of what they identify as historical Vermont gun control laws indicative of firearm storage, and examples which they argue give precedent for H-230 to survive the new scrutiny imposed in the Bruin decision. The only problem with this is that the examples they provided were not laws, nor did they have anything to do with gun control. They were a list of town ordinances which dealt with the manufacture and keeping of black powder in large quantities for commercial sale and use. One specific law, however, which we've heard a lot about already, and certainly has precedent, was the District of Columbia's longstanding mandate on keeping firearms locked and rendered inoperable for the purpose of self-defense in one's home, a law which shared uncanny similarities with the safe storage provision in H-230 and was quite literally the nexus of the 2008 Supreme Court case, DC versus Heller, in which the court struck down the law as unconstitutional. Now, from the case text, I'll quote, "The requirement that any lawful firearm in the home be disassembled or bound by a trigger lock makes it impossible for citizens to use arms for the core lawful purpose of self-defense and is hence unconstitutional. In sum, we hold the district's ban on handguns violates the Second Amendment, as does its prohibition against rendering any lawful firearm in the home operable for self-defense," end quote. As we've also heard extensively last year in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, the court reiterated the language from the Heller and McDonald decisions that, quote, the Second Amendment does not permit, let alone require judges to assess the cost and benefits of firearms restrictions under means and scrutiny. And it continues, in sum, the Court of Appeal's second step is inconsistent with Heller's historical approach in its rejection of means and scrutiny. And we reiterate that the standard for applying the Second Amendment is as follows. When the Second Amendment's plain text covers an individual's conduct, the Constitution presumptively protects that conduct. The government must then justify its regulation by demonstrating that it's consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation. And this means, as we interpret it, that not only are the specific mechanics of this bill, but also the rationalization that such legislation by the subjective belief that the regulation is reasonable, both clearly unconstitutional. Measures such as mandatory lockup requirements or periods are modern inventions created by those who seek to restrict the right to keep and bear arms. They failed the test by all practical, ethical, and constitutional measures. So is H-230 about suicides or is it about guns? At the end of the day, we find ourselves skeptical that a legislature which has pioneered end-of-life initiatives, or more commonly known as assisted suicide, means what they say when they advance these sorts of bills in the name of reducing suicides. Is it the suicide itself that's objectionable? Or is it independent suicide occurring of one's own volition without the blessing of the state and using a device which politicians have long sought to restrict? One is left to wonder if the goal of this bill is actually to reduce deaths by suicide, why so much time, effort, and money is spent trying to find an end around the Constitution in an obsession with one single tool with which suicides are carried out, especially when the larger issue is such a broad and encompassing one with plenty of other areas to make progress, more low-hanging fruit, as it were, without the myriad of issues so prevalent in this type of gun control legislation. We continue to oppose this bill in its entirety, and we encourage lawmakers to pursue other more meaningful measures in harm reduction that do not punish honest, law-abiding people of Vermont. And thank you for your consideration, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions anyone might have.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Senator Bowski and then Senator Bruce.
Thank you for your testimony. I'm wondering if you can point me towards the research that your suicide statistics come from. Is that cited in your written testimony to the House?
I have linked to anything that I thought relevant in both of those testimony. What specific statistics are you looking for?
I mean, generally, when people start spouting statistics around suicides and planning and methodology, it's helpful to know what research study they came from.
Sure. So the testimony that I gave about folks that consider suicides and make a plan and stuff, that came from a personal conversation that I had with a longtime physician. He was a physician, an emergency room physician in New York City for years and years, and was from a lengthy discussion from someone who had experience in that area. If you want some more, very specific stuff, I'm sure I could dig up some stuff for you, but I think anything that's not anecdotal is linked in the written testimony that I provided. So
Great, thank you.
Senator Bruce.
Thank you. I'm just trying to find the piece that triggers the illegality on the safe storage, that it has to involve actions with the gun once it's taken. Eric?
Yes, on page 5.
Oh, okay.
Lines
So-
3 through 9.
Yeah, thank you. So, Eric, I'm wondering, this doesn't, as I understand it, it doesn't, as you say, punish law-abiding owners for self-defense. It carves out self-defense. But what it does is if the gun is not secured, that in and of itself isn't a violation of this. It's only a violation if the gun is then used in a threatening or hurtful manner that causes injury to others. So it seems to me that it specifically doesn't target lawful behavior, but only when the gun has been used in a way to harm others. What would your thought be on that?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I'm a little confused. I believe you're talking to the specific carve out that says that the safe storage doesn't apply if a firearm is used in a self-defense scenario, and I'm a little confused by that because I'm curious how in an immediate need to defend oneself in the middle of the night, how you're supposed to access your firearm to do so if it's kept locked up, with a trigger lock separately from the ammunition. That's seems like an awful lot of steps to go through to access your firearm so that you can use it to defend yourself. So it seems like there's a little bit of a contradiction in the language of the bill there, almost like, there was an attempted carve out to get around the Heller decision. But, from a practical standpoint, I'm not really sure how that would work. You either have access to your firearm or you don't. And to be very clear, we support safe storage of firearms. We support voluntary safe storage of firearms. I have a 4-year-old son myself. All of my hardware is kept under very heavy lock and key because, incidents involving, misuse of anything is, are tragic. But I think another good underlying point to make to that effect, though, is if negligence is the issue at hand, then maybe it should be negligence in general that's addressed and not with the specific narrow focus on firearms. And I use the example, if it would be any less tragic if I negligently stored a loaded gun where my 4-year-old could access it and he got his hands on it and got hurt, would that be better or worse than if I failed to pay attention to him and let him go play in traffic or wander across the road and drown in the neighbor's swimming pool? If the underlying issue is to address negligence, then go ahead and do that. But it's the specific focus on the broad focus on restriction of access to one's own firearms in their home that we have a problem with.
Right, and on page 5 of the bill, I don't know if you have it in front of you,
Yeah.
but under the penalty section, it says that the penalties only apply if, so they don't automatically apply. They apply if the child or a prohibited person, someone who should not have a gun legally, gains access to the firearm and uses it in the commission of a crime or displays it in a threatening manner. So I've known you long enough to know I don't think you're defending the right of anyone, including a child, to pick up someone's firearm and commit a crime with it or display it in a threatening manner. And that's all that's criminalized here.
Certainly. Okay. So am I under
So
am
under the penalty section,
am I mistaken on the impression that if the firearm is a person shall not within any premises that are under the person's custody or control store or keep a firearm if the person knows or reasonably should know that a child or prohibited person is likely to gain access to the firearm unless the person stores or keeps the firearm, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know, maybe this is just my, inexperience in, legal type stuff and wording as it were, but it seems like there's a very specific prohibition on keeping your firearm handy for the purposes of self-defense.
Well, that's what's confusing about the way the House bill is drafted. Not that it's the drafter's fault.
It is a little confusing, Senator, and I'm sorry, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a guy that has a very specific interest in this sort of stuff. So,
Eric, I think whether you support it or don't support it, it would be better to follow the New Hampshire model and call it negligent storage of firearms, because that's really what you're getting at. Somebody who negligently stores a firearm and someone who is a child under the age of 16 under the New Hampshire law, or a person who's not allowed to possess a firearm, gets that firearm and uses it in a threatening or uses it to kill somebody, et cetera, et cetera. That's what the bill looks at, is negligent storage of firearms. And I think that it would be clearer if we actually called it that. And I don't know what the original bill looked like. But it seems as though the House Judiciary Committee changed the bill to look at that negligence and didn't call it negligence.
Mr. Chair, if I might, could I ask Eric to just speak to that question, what the bill is criminalizing or penalizing, and address the confusion that Eric talked about?
I think that, and Eric Federick with the Office of Legislative Counsel, that it's, as you were mentioning, Senator Ruth, there's only a criminal penalty that kicks in if the firearm is stored in a way that violates the storage requirements, which are in page 3, subsection A1. As Eric Davis was saying, that's the language about if you're in a premises under a person's custody or control, you know, or reasonably should know the child or included person can gain access. That's the storage requirement. But if you violate that requirement, there's only a criminal penalty if one of those further consequences occurs. And that could be either that the child or prohibited person gains access, uses it to commit a crime or a threatening manner, or more serious 5-year felony, cause death or serious.
So is it fair to say that there's no penalty for not securing your weapon, and there's no penalty for using your weapon in self-defense? There's only a penalty if the weapon is then used in one of these described ways, threatening manner or commission of a crime.
That's why I'm saying it should be negligent, not negligent storage of the firearm, rather than all the other stuff that's in there. Because that's really what they've done. It's not even though they have a sign that says it's against the law, it's really not. Because there's no penalty.
The only thing I would add, Senator Ruth, is that no criminal penalty.
Right.
That's what I would add to what you said.
Well, you can have a civil penalty.
Well, no, yeah, that there's no civil, not in the judicial bureau sense, but the fact that prohibition is there in law, so that even if it was stored improperly, one of the additional criminal consequences did not occur. But some other consequence occurred, or perhaps less than that. It could be the basis of a civil law. So it's not
That's what
saying
I'm
no
saying,
criminal penalty.
civil, yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's what I meant by civil law
Right.
too. Okay, can we, thank you very much, Eric. Appreciate your testimony and your.
Thank you, Senators.
And that of the gun owners of Vermont. Next, we have Alyssa Black, who is a representative, but is here as an impacted citizen, not as a representative.
Hi,
I see that
you,
Bob's here
Senator.
too.
yes,
We,
Rob Black is
way back.
behind me.
way back a few years ago, we had testimony from you on various on this subject. So welcome back, and I'm sorry it's under these conditions.
Thank you. So for the record, Representative Alyssa Black, and full disclosure, I'm the lead sponsor of H230 and the reporter from House Healthcare for H230. But I'm not here in that capacity today. I'm here I've been asked to be here in the capacity of Alyssa Black, just Alyssa Black. And I got this invitation, and Peggy sent me the invitation. And I was thinking about, okay, well, what am I going to say to you? I know everyone here. I've told my story to all of you at one time or another. And I kept getting caught up in this loop of remembering where I was 4 years ago and where I am now. And I can remember, other than last week, the last time I stepped foot in this room right here, I'll never forget. We were lucky enough, and I really mean that, we were lucky. We were lucky because we reached out to a lobbyist. We knew we were in over our heads. We reached out to a lobbyist. And this lobbyist got us a meeting with Senator Dick Sears. And in January of 2019, I walked into the State House for the first time in my entire life. And we had lived in Montpelier. And we came into this room and I sat right there where where Senator Wielowski is sitting right now. And you, Mr. Chair, were sitting right there in your seats. And Mr. President, you were sitting right there. And I remember how scared I was. I was frightened. Like these people. And to come into the State House as a nobody. And that's what I thought of myself as I'm just a nobody. And I don't belong here. And how intimidating it is for someone, just a regular Vermonter, to walk into this place and bear open the worst thing that's ever happened in their entire life. All because they just want for this not to happen to somebody else. And now I sit in this building every day, and I come into this building every day. And in 3 years, I'm finally feeling really comfortable walking through this building. And I don't get scared sitting here anymore. I don't get scared sitting at the top of the table in the House Healthcare, which I now sit in. But I see the exact same thing happen over and over again within my own committee and within all the other committees. Every single day, we hear from the same people over and over and over again. I can look at your witness list, and it's the same people that I bet you see all the time. We've got to bring in the stakeholders, the interested parties. But it never leaves room for Vermonters. There's no room for Vermonters. And I'm really privileged that I get to sit now in the seat and that there's room for me. But in my years, I've had other people come to me. And so I thought I would share a little bit more about the people who have opened up to me, because I'm a safe space for them to come. And every single person that I can mention that I have just heard from in the last 2 weeks, every single one of these people came to this State House at one time or another to advocate for something. And the doors were shut in their face and they gave up. And every one of them, I asked, will you testify? And they all say, I can't do it. It took too much out of me. And nobody listened anyways. I can't bring that back up again. Linda and Charles Livendale, their son, Joe, 29 years old, Barry, Vermont. He got a DUI on a Friday. It was his second DUI. He was an engineer, very accomplished. He went out, skipped work on Monday morning, went to the gun store, went home, shot himself. The Livendales were here in 2004 advocating for a waiting period. And they got the door shut in their face. Kathy Lochner, she lives a half a mile away from me. I hear all the time, well, there's only 2 documented cases in the state. Well, that's because only 2 people were idiots enough to put it in their obituaries or their children's obituaries. So those are the only 2 that they can, and I count myself as one of those idiots. Their son, Joe, 21 years old, a senior, finishing up his finals at UVM. This was in 2014. He skipped his last final, went to the same gun shop where my son went to, bought a gun, took it out to the woods, shot himself. The Lofners were here in 2016. They were on the news. They were advocating. They weren't even advocating for a waiting period. You know what they were advocating for? Please, gun shops, don't sell guns to college students in the week of finals. That was it. 1 week of finals. Try not to sell guns to 21, 22-year-olds who are taking their finals. Same neighborhood. Aaron Shui. He was in my son's class. He was caught shoplifting at the Hannaford, and his friend accessed a firearm that his parents kept in a shoebox and brought it over to Aaron's house. And he got on his bicycle and drove over to Essex High School and shot himself by the tennis courts at Essex High School. He was 15 years old. That's the same neighborhood, right down the street from the Lofners, a half a mile from my house. I don't even have to go a half a mile from my house. Paul Henning, Cheryl Hannah's husband, he was here also, asking for the same things. My dear friend now, Emily Hackett Fisk, 12-year-old, goes to her ex-husband's house, watches a YouTube video on how to shoot herself, and 4 minutes later, shoots himself. 12 years old. When I think about how bad I've got it, at least I had 11 more years with my son than she got with hers. Grateful. I'm grateful for her. So I'll tell you about my son. I had a son. His name was Andrew. He was 23 years old. He was at this very transitional point in his life. Rob and I were just talking about this the other night. It was like a confluence of things that happened to him. He had worked in a job for 7 years. He had a whole work family. He had been dating the same girl for 3 years. Been on again, off again. He ended that relationship. But his entire social circle was sort of built around that 3-year relationship. So he lost his social circle. He lost his work circle. He got a new job, started working at Lawson's Finest Liquids, his dream job. He had been trying to get into a brewery. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Not that he'd been trying to get into a brewery, because he'd had offers at multiple places. He wanted to work for the best. He wanted to go to the Alchemist, or he wanted to go to Lawson's. And he started his job at Lawson's. He'd lost his friends. He'd lost his work family. He was in a new position where he didn't know anyone. And for about 2 months of his life, he was a little lonely. And then he saw a picture of his ex-girlfriend on Facebook, sitting on the lap of her new boyfriend. And that was it. That was it. I lost my son because he saw a picture of an ex-girlfriend sitting on somebody's lap. And he started contacting her. And for 36 hours, he spiraled down into this. I have every text message that he sent in those 36 hours, and she was the only one he was communicating with. I'll always love you, but I just can't be with you anymore. To which she said, nobody will ever love you like I loved you. And he's like, you're right. I just can't go on. And I watched him send messages as he was sitting in the parking lot of the gun shop. Send messages afterwards. I can't breathe. I've never had such a hard time breathing in all my life. I did something today that I should not have done, but I did it, and now it's too late. I can't take it back. For hours, sending these messages. And he finally sent a picture of that gun sitting on his bed. And that was when someone finally reached out. But it was too late. He closed his door, locked his door. He never locked his door. He took the dog. The dog was always in the room with him. Took the dog and put the dog out. I guess he didn't want the dog to see him. And he laid down in his bed. And he had this Vermont flannel stadium blanket. And he wrapped it all around his head. I said this in my bill report. I love to think that maybe he did that. Because for one last second, he was thinking about his mom. And he was thinking, I don't want my mom to have to clean my brain matter off the wall. It didn't work. I still had to clean brain matter off that wall. Couldn't get it off. Not even a magic eraser would take it off. It's painted over now, but I know it's still underneath that paint. We used to go to the range together. He used to school me in how to shoot. I remember he used to always say, Mom, it's all about the breath. Deep inhale, you fire on the exhale. And I think when he was putting that gun up to his head, right behind his right ear, you know exactly where it was. I wonder if he took his last deep inhale. I wonder if he fired on the exhale. I'm grateful I got 23 years with my son. You can find gratitude in even the most unimaginable things. The coroner said he died instantly. I'm so grateful for that. I didn't have to lose my son. If a bill like this, if those other people had come here and they had been listened to, I wouldn't have had to lose my son. And I am going to sit here and I am not leaving this place until I make certain that there are less people like me left behind. This never goes away. I can be Speaker of the House. I can be Chair of Senate Judiciary. This pain never, ever will ever go away. This is what I will live with until the day I die. And frankly, that's going to be a great day, because that's the day I finally get to see Andrew again. Happy to answer any questions you want. Also happy to answer any questions you might have about the bill or any reasoning on the bill, although I know I'm not here in that capacity.
Senator Bruce has a question.
Thank you, thank you. So you mentioned the meeting where we first met, and I just want to extend the memory just a bit. So we were able that year to pass a bill. Wasn't the strongest bill, but we passed a bill. And the governor waited until just a couple of hours before it would have become law, and then vetoed it.
Yeah.
And I told you both that we would eventually pass this bill, and I still did.
And this is a better bill.
Yeah.
I believe this is a better bill.
The other thing I just wanted to comment on, you painted this picture of your neighborhood, which is really everybody's neighborhood, and the tragedies that have occurred so close to your house. I just want to add one thing that I got this morning. So state's attorneys and sheriffs passed on to me a message from DPS, Department of Public Safety, and there was this past Saturday an incident at a gun range in Waterbury where someone went in, rented a gun, bought ammo, shot for 40 minutes, and then turned the gun on themselves. And that's currently under investigation, but they've announced it. So we're not talking about something that is limited to your family. And I have the hardest time with people who dispute the idea that Vermont has an exceptional problem with suicide by gun. We are among the worst in the nation, and we have to address it. So,
If I can relay a small story, again, my frustration has always been that, none of this information is not collated anywhere. This is information that's received from police reports. They're signed off by the state's attorney. They go in a file and they're never to be seen again. Nobody takes this data. And one of my frustrations has always been, well, this never happens. We met with, at the time, the Attorney General. I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this story. And I said to him, this never happens. And I remember him visibly like throwing his head back and laughing. And he said, well, when I was district attorney in the same county that I live in, he said, I can think of, he stopped for a second, he said, I can think of 5 just here in Essex. My one little town. In just the time that he was state's attorney.
Any other questions? Lucy, could I, it's about the bill. And I've been having a hard time, frankly, understanding the safe storage sections because it seems disjointed. Did the House Judiciary Committee make several changes from the healthcare?
They did make a few changes. So originally there had been $100 fine. And you actually did mention something which I will say that probably wasn't noticed until too late. The signage behind, the click it or ticket.
Yeah.
The signage behind, once that $100, the Judiciary Committee took out the $100 fine, and yet we didn't really look at the signage because it does make that last sentence of the signage, to use your analogy, the click it or ticket.
Yeah.
So that was not changed.
New Hampshire has a state storage bill, but I'm not suggesting we go all the way with it, but it's called negligent storage of firearms, which I think better describes what we have here. And their signage is that it's important that the owner of the firearm seek firearm safety instruction from a certified firearms instructor and keep firearms secured from unauthorized use. And in their case, again, I'm not suggesting that we follow their law completely, but in their case, you can keep our same penalty section, but redo that wording of the warning, because it really isn't. It only is if something happens because you didn't distribute that warning.
Well, it is, the only penalties come in if something happens, and when drafting it with legislative counsel, I thought it was very important that we actually spell out what the expectations were, that it's not just negligent storage, but that these are the expectations of what proper storage is.
But it has become negligent storage.
I guess I don't have
It's
an
okay
answer.
to spell out what proper safe storage is. But there's no penalty if you,
There is
unless something
currently,
happens.
there is currently no penalty unless something happens.
Right.
Something bad happens.
The other part of the bill, the waiting period, how did they come to 72 hours? Is there something magic about 72, 48, or 24?
I came
The
to,
governor vetoed 24, so I'm
I
not sure
came,
he wouldn't be.
I came to 72 for two reasons.
Okay.
If you look at waiting periods across all states that currently have waiting periods, they range from 72 at the very low. I believe there's 3 states, please don't quote me on that, I start to get numbers mixed up. 3 states have 72 and they go up to 2 weeks. I simply settled on the lowest, and the other reasoning is if you recall in the governor's veto letter for the 24-hour waiting period, he specifically cited that he was unable to find any evidence that a waiting period of 24 hours would make a difference. And that's because there is no evidence, because there is no other state that actually has 24 hours only. And so therefore, that was very clear that he was concerned about that. So I wanted to make sure that we had precedent in other states, and there are 3 other states with 72-hour waiting periods. And so that addresses his concern.
Any other questions for Representative Black? Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you for
appreciate it.
having me.
And, we'll continue to work on the bill.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Rebecca Bell, who's pediatrics critical care at the University of Vermont Children's Hospital. Nice to have you.
Thanks for having me.
I've got to step out for a brief minute. I'll be right back. But Senator Sheen will take over.
So thank you for having me back. For the record, my name is Dr. Rebecca Bell. I'm a pediatric ICU physician at UVM Children's Hospital. And I'm the president of the Vermont chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics and president-elect of Vermont Medical Society. And I'm here speaking on behalf of both of those organizations in support of H230. And for the record, there are a few other medical organizations in Vermont in support. So in addition, also the Vermont Academy of Family Physicians, Vermont Psychiatric Association, and the University of Vermont Health Network. I sent some testimony last week, and I have paper copies if anyone wants. Yeah, I'll just hand it up. Or one person in this back, yeah. So Vermont physicians are really concerned about our high rate of suicide death in Vermont, and we see this to be true across all age groups. I testified in front of House Healthcare Committee broadly with a colleague on suicide prevention in Vermont and what we're doing in the medical community. And we really feel like H230 can help support and augment the work that we're already doing to help prevent and reduce suicide deaths in Vermont. I'll take a moment just to say that I think the last time I testified to this committee was 4 years ago. And I also followed Representative Black, who was not Representative Black at the time. And I had never met Alyssa or Rob. And I was so grateful that they shared their story, because these are the stories of Vermont. And I remember saying at the time, after they shared their story about Andrew, I said, you know, this is not a unique tragedy. This is the story of Vermont. As physicians, we cannot tell these stories. They're not our stories to tell. But hearing more people coming forward to tell their stories again, it shouldn't be their burden to do so, but I think it helps reflect that what we're hearing is not these one single unique tragedies, that what we're hearing is this pattern of folks in Vermont who during an impulsive act died by suicide. And I think it highlights how preventable these tragedies really are. So I really appreciate people who are willing to share their stories. So I take care of critically ill or injured children or adolescents who need the ICU. We're the only pediatric ICU in Vermont. And so I take care of children who are seriously injured or sick from a suicide attempt or who die by suicide. And then I also sit on the Vermont State Child Fatality Review Team. And so we review all unexpected child deaths in Vermont. And that includes all of the suicide deaths in those children 17 years and younger. And what really got me into thinking more about how we prevent firearm suicide deaths are truly reviewing those cases in detail and understanding the impulsive nature of these stories. And so I want to talk a little bit about dispelling some myths around how we think about suicide. And so some really common myths, and they're very understandable, probably stuff that I thought before my clinical training, is that suicide deaths are predictable either at a population or an individual level. And that is actually not the case. And that is what makes moving the needle on reducing suicide deaths so hard. So if you think about things like cancer or heart disease, you know, you've got this population, you have risk factors that can make people at risk for those diseases, and then you have signs and symptoms that those patients might have, and you might be able to guess how many people will have this affliction, how serious it might be. You might be able to guess who might get seriously ill or die from this. And suicide's really not like that, which makes it really hard. So you might expect that if you took a population, so you have the population as like at the base of a pyramid, and this is your whole population, that you would have a certain percentage that then would have major depression, right? And that's kind of moving up the pyramid. And then of those people who have severe depressive symptoms, some percentage of that might have thoughts of suicide. And then of those people, some percentage might have a plan to die by suicide. And then some small percentage of that would attempt suicide, and then some percentage would die. With the thought that, okay, those at the top, those who die by suicide, are the most strongly afflicted from all of those. They've kind of moved up the pyramid, and those that have died are sort of the sickest. And that's actually not what we see with suicide. We see people in the general population who just die by suicide without going through all those steps. And then when we compare that pyramid to other states, we see differences. And in Vermont, our pyramid is top heavy. So we have more suicide deaths in Vermont than you might expect based on those pieces that sort of lead up to the pyramid. So in Vermont, we have really robust data among young people, middle schoolers and high schoolers over decades. And
Quick question, just to clarify, when you say in Vermont, it's very top heavy, are you referring to the impulsive suicides where you're not seeing that track?
Right.
Okay.
So, right, exactly. So you might have, if you could say compared to another state, you might you have a higher percentage of population who say report depressive symptoms or even report attempting suicide, but fewer deaths compared to Vermont. And so the examples of some of the really robust data we have on that is through the youth risk behavior survey, which we middle schoolers and high schoolers in Vermont take every other year. And we can compare all of our results to other states. So that they add the questions that this survey asks, and we have data through decades, is have you had basically severe depressive symptoms over the last year so much that you're unable to do stuff for 2 weeks? Over the last year, have you had thoughts of suicide, and have you attempted suicide? And most of the Vermont youth take this across the country.
But would it be fair to say that both death by suicide is underreported? In other words, a lot of people may, and I also think death by overdose is underreported. And Representative Black's testimony indicates that death by suicide by firearm is underreported, because we've had these, I probably have 400 emails, 250 of them repeat that there's only 2 suicide deaths in Vermont as a result of impulse purchase. And Representative Black pointed, I think 5 or 6 cases, I didn't count that. So clearly there's that information, but I think families tend to not report and the causes that, and I know that's true of overdose as well. But for example, there was a car hit by a train. And the question is, did the guy stop on the railroad tracks in order to get hit by the train, or did the car, just malfunction? He couldn't get out of the way. You just don't know. So I'm wondering if our statistics that we're using underreported.
So we know, the medical examiner we have statistics on people who died, say, by firearm, or have died due to poisonings. And you're right that sometimes the intent is not clear, and that's up to the medical examiner to try to determine, and sometimes that's undetermined. To your point, if someone dies by poisoning, by a drug overdose, what was the intent behind that? But we do have statistics on how many people do die from poisonings or do die from firearms. And I think, and generally we have a sense of intent there. What you're talking about is sort of public reporting and families coming forward to say, this is what happened. And I agree. I think over the years, we are seeing families more often, more likely to report publicly that their loved one maybe died from, an overdose or died by suicide. I agree with you that it's generally not public knowledge, and families, again, like it's a hard thing to talk about, and they shouldn't have to talk about it publicly. But to Representative Black's point, she's talking about cases that have happened, in her neighborhood that she didn't know about. So I agree that I think the public awareness of this is low. And the reporting of the youth on, this is self-reports, going back to that data where they report their feelings of depression or suicide, have they made a suicide attempt? This is a self-report. But it's been pretty consistent over the decades. And when we compare those, although those numbers are getting higher and we don't want them to get higher, we always have lower rates of youth reporting those things than other states, but a higher death rate. And so again, like if you looked at Vermont and you just looked at, our rates of depression and even our rates of suicide attempts, you would expect us to have a lower suicide death rate, and we don't. And the reason why we don't is because of the method that people do use when they make a suicide attempt. And firearms are by far the most deadly method that can be used in a suicide attempt. And in Vermont, we have, if we look at all of our suicide deaths, more than half are due to firearms. So if you take all the other methods combined and add them up, it's still less common than firearms. So when we think about when we think about lethality of means, we think about things like the inherent deadliness of the method, the ease of use, accessibility, and then the ability to abort mid-attempt. So firearms do not allow you to change your mind and don't give you a second chance. We have in Vermont a pretty stunning statistic, which is that we have more firearm deaths than visits to the ER for firearm injuries, and that includes people who will later go on to die. And in my practice, I do sometimes take care of young people with self-inflicted firearm injuries, but usually not, because usually they do not make it to the hospital. And so we can do a lot of stuff in the ICU for our pediatric patients, and we can do a lot of stuff for people who are seriously ill or injured from a suicide attempt. But those who use a firearm, we can't help them. And when I do help people who are seriously ill from a suicide attempt, we feel really good about that, because we know from long-term data, when we follow people who needed medical attention from a serious suicide attempt, we follow them over decades. 90% of them do not go on to later die by suicide. So one of the questions is always like, well, if we limit someone's ability to, attempt suicide or die by suicide, are they just going to later go on to find a way there? And that's actually not the case. And so keeping people safe during that attempt is really important. I wanted to just skip to this flow chart on the back on the second page, because I think that really gives an image of what we're trying to do in the healthcare community when we try to keep our patients safe. And so when we look at this flow chart, this is from a study in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. And this is sort of what we think about when we try to keep people safe. So the first circle talks about means restriction. And so you can think about waiting periods and child access prevention or safe storage as a type of means restriction. So that's when you take a highly lethal, commonly used suicide method and you make it either less accessible or less lethal. And then one of two things would happen. So one is actually a delay. So the person actually doesn't make any attempt. And I think that sometimes surprises people, because they think, okay, well, if they can't get the firearm, they're just gonna definitely just use something else. And actually that's not always the case. Sometimes there's a specific plan in mind. When that plan is thwarted, no attempt is made. Or what could happen is there's method substitution. So the person uses a different method, and any method by definition is going to be less lethal than firearms. So then we have fewer attempts that prove fatal. And again, 90% will go on to die by suicide. And that's the general idea behind trying to get our suicide rates down, or death rates down. So in the medical community, we've now understood the impulsive nature of suicide, and in particular of firearm suicide. So the other thing that's surprising to people is they think, well, if someone picked up a firearm rather than another method in their suicide attempt, then they must have really wanted to die. Like they must have been like very intent on dying. And actually, this is sort of strange, but actually, what we find in the research is that people who use firearms actually tend to do so more impulsively. So when you compare those who use firearms to someone who say ingest medications, for instance, overdoses on medications, you compare those two, those who use firearms have thought about suicide for a shorter amount of time. They're less likely to have a mental health diagnosis, and they're less likely to have made an attempt in the past. So that is really hard for us as physicians to look at a patient and say, or our patient population, and say, how do we protect those people if they don't have a mental health diagnosis, if they've never made a suicide attempt in the past? And oftentimes they're experiencing a crisis, like an interpersonal crisis. And so how do we predict when that's going to happen? And as a pediatrician, I worry about our adolescents, and I can say, like, we cannot predict when an adolescent is going to have a crisis. You heard some of the very specific stories from Representative Black, and I cannot highlight how just impulsive some of these acts are. They are truly, I mean, in Vermont, we have young people who shoot themselves having an argument with their parents. Like, it is very impulsive, and it's a lot of emotion, and people are feeling a lot of pain in the moment. They want the pain to go away. And that's what they do. But these are not stories of, okay, this person is showing that they're just inevitably going to die by suicide. This is like a very temporary crisis. So as pediatricians, we and other physicians, we really realize that we can't just try to predict who's going to die. What we need to do is just universally talk about firearms and safe storage of firearms, and thinking and having people be aware of the risk. And since the last time I've spoken to you, we've made some progress on this. So we now have much better, so this is something I wasn't trained at in medical school or residency. I wasn't taught how to have conversations about safe storage, and we need to do so in a very non-judgmental way. We need to do so in an evidence-based way that will get people to change their practice. We've learned a lot about this over the years. So I've been able to do some of this work through the Vermont Child Health Improvement Program, creating modules for healthcare providers on how to have these conversations. I've been lucky enough to contribute to national work on this. So there's a module called, I have links in my testimony to some of these modules where we talk about the importance of storing the firearms locked up and unloaded with the ammunition stored separately. And this is just universally where we, how we counsel. We have ways to talk to families who are not going to quite get all the way to that, safest storage, but we can sort of move them in that direction. And the other piece of work that has happened recently is the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Vermont put together this group of stakeholders, including I was part of the group from the Health Network, but also the Vermont State Police, the Sheriff's Association, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, to talk about, of course, the Department of Health and Department of Mental Health, to talk about safe storage of firearms. So there are new PSAs out. There's a new website, gunsenseit.org, that talks about where folks can get free cable locks that are not just in the places you would normally imagine, but also in libraries, and talking about how important that is to store your firearms safely. And the second piece of that is removal of firearms from the home if you're worried about somebody in the home. And that again goes to this, if you go back to this flow sheet, sometimes the answer is we need to remove the firearms from the home. And so there are now sites, and this has taken years, and the Attorney General's office really worked hard on this over the past few years to create sites around the state of Vermont with FFLs, partnerships with FFLs, so that folks can temporarily and voluntarily store their firearms outside of their home. There's a lot of reasons why someone might want to do that. But again, what we see here is like a group of a wide array of stakeholders saying, like, we understand that storing firearms safely, thinking about removing firearms from the home is an important message that we really need to get out everywhere. So that was a nice collaborative effort. And then lastly, I talked about the Vermont medical organizations that are in support, and nationally, all the large medical organizations support measures like waiting periods, like child access prevention. Because really, from a health and safety standpoint, there are benefits without any health and safety drawbacks. And I know that you're the Judiciary Committee, so you have a lot of other considerations besides health and safety. You're thinking about the legal aspects and there's convenience aspects and cultural aspects that all need to be considered. And so I know, envy you and having to do all that, but you oftentimes can't get large groups of physicians to all agree on the same thing, but things like waiting periods, child access prevention, that's an easy thing to get behind, that you'll see every major medical organization support, because again, from a health and safety standpoint, there are benefits without drawbacks.
Senator Hashim and then Senator Mills.
Thank you for your testimony. I guess I want to repeat a question that's already been asked of another witness. But the 72 hours, could you talk about why and how 72 hours is the right number compared to 48 or 24 hours, and what data backs that up?
Yeah, so I agree that there are no states that have something shorter than 72 hours. I think that, California, I think has 10 days, or Hawaii maybe has 14 days. So some of those are longer. We do see 24, when we are able to look back at survivors of near lethal suicide attempts. We do have some folks that a certain percentage where they make the time that elapses between when they first have the thought in their mind and the time to the attempt. Sometimes it's less than 5 minutes. But then we do have some that will last 24 hours. And it does sort of diminish over time. I don't know if I can get you, I can look into this and see if we have like a specific time around 72. Like I think you're going to get the most in that first 24, 48, 72 hours. But sometimes it can last a little bit, those impulses can last a little bit longer. Yeah. I don't know if there's some of the other policy folks might actually know that.
Okay.
The answer to that too.
Yeah, that would be great. I just want to make sure that, some folks will say that 72 hours is arbitrary, but I'd like to confirm that there's actually a reason why 3 days is being chosen, as opposed to 2 days or 5 days or anything.
Sure. Yeah.
So, thank you.
Yeah, and part of that too is looking at, we see reductions in firearm suicide in those. We have to look at what's out there. So we know that states that have the 72 hour, at least 72 hours show a reduction. So I think that we definitely have the evidence to say at least 72 hours, right? When we look at what's already.
Is that in any of the citations that are on here that?
No, I can give you that.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
Oh, go ahead.
I wonder, and this is not the question I had for you, but I wonder if it makes sense, given that 72 hours also aligns with our mental health hold procedures in the state. I wonder if it makes sense to hear from someone within the mental health arena around this particular piece. But I have two questions for you. One, in your role as someone who investigates child deaths by suicide, those that occurred from firearms, do you have any estimate or statistics around what percentage of those firearms were not stored securely?
So it's well.
Sorry, I realize I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm just trying to actually think through. One of the challenges in Vermont with these deaths is that oftentimes the young person uses the firearm that in the home that is sort of theirs. And so young people are gifted firearms, and as part of families wanting to teach young people to be responsible with their firearm, they also sort of put them in charge of storing the firearm. And so then that young person can access that firearm, right? And so, but typically not all the components of safe storage are in place, or it's a young person that it's their firearm. So it might be locked up, but they're in charge of locking it up. And so one of the pieces around counseling around this is, we know about just under half of Vermont households have firearms, right? So they're really prevalent. We have young people who use firearms, with families, with their family, with hunting, recreational shooting. But what we really see when we're counseling families and we're talking to families about this is that a young person, and that includes, it really includes adolescents, should not have access to the firearm unsupervised. This is how we counsel, because exactly that, because if they come home from school, something happens at school, right? They come home from school and it's their firearm that they use, to go hunting with their family on the weekend. And that's a firearm that they use. So So we have young people who will be sort of in charge of locking their firearms, but then they have access, then they are the ones who have access it, yeah.
I just point out, I looked on the website of every town for gun safety. Only 9 states have waiting periods, which is surprising to me.
Yeah, I don't know. if
Even
this-
Massachusetts, which has some of the strongest gun laws, and New York, don't have waiting periods.
So some states, like I know Massachusetts, they have a permit. So some have like de facto waiting periods, meaning somebody couldn't just get a firearm immediately. So it kind of
Maybe-
does the same thing.
Maybe our next witness is from.
Yeah, I think probably is,
Safety
yeah.
could
Yeah,
Help
So-
us with that.
yeah.
My follow-up question, like, I think sometimes it's difficult to sort of wrap our heads around, you know, a young person having a fight with their parents and leading to
Mhm.
death by suicide. Can you just give a little bit of an overview of sort of the brain development of young people and how those impulsive and seemingly to us from the outside, overreactive responses happen?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we find if you're looking, and again, this is counterintuitive to what you would think, that young people who say use a firearm in a suicide attempt, and this includes, I'm saying young people, this includes adolescents, because that's but it includes up through mid-20s, especially in men, that the folks who are more likely to do that are not so much necessarily the folks who, again, have like long histories of depression and prior suicide attempts, but folks that have a history of impulsive behavior. So that kid, you know, that 16-year-old that gets mad and punches a wall, like that's the kind of behavior. Like it's like this like outburst of like emotion, that it's those individuals that are more likely in the same way to have this like emotional response. And sometimes it's like an I'll show you type response. It's not so much again like, and so this is why we can't predict this, right? I mean, I do worry about when we see kids in the ICU or in the emergency room that have had, say, like they get in a fight or a physical fight, or again they punch something, or they do something sort of risky or impulsive. Those are the kids in our minds that are more likely to, say, pick up a firearm and hurt themselves. So that's a kind of, it's a truly, I'll say this again, because it's words that have come out of people's mouths before, like I'll show you, like, and that's a kind of like impulse.
And I guess my question is sort of, as the brain fully matures and that prefrontal cortex starts to allow for more thought out decisions that that really consider the long-term consequences, do we see that rate of impulsive firearm use and suicide drop off, say, in the mid-20s? And maybe you don't have that statistic.
Yeah, that's so I think that there's probably an aspect to that. I don't know for sure. I also know though that when people are experiencing a crisis, then really anyone's at risk. So we do see in older folks, like around a loss of a job or a divorce or something like that, kind of those kind, they can sort of get into that space as well. So so I assume it's better. I assume it's less, there's fewer impulsive acts, but I actually don't know the answer to that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Appreciate your testimony. Our final witness for today will be Allison Shy, and I apologize to other witnesses. Hopefully, we have 2 other witnesses, and hopefully they can join us tomorrow or next week. Take a bill again. Peggy, well, yeah, we've got John Rogers on there. We obviously aren't gonna get to Market.
Bob Rogers.
Huh?
Bob Rogers.
So he's the only witness tomorrow.
Well, we could have Billy Clark and Rebecca if they can do that. So Allison, welcome to Senate Judiciary.
Morning, everyone. My name is Allison Sheik. I serve as counsel at Everytown for Gun Safety, where I'm responsible for supporting state legislative efforts in Vermont. Everytown's the largest gun violence prevention organization in the country. We have more than 10 million supporters, including moms, mayors, veterans, survivors, gun owners, and everyday Americans who are fighting for public safety measures that can help save lives. I want to thank you all for allowing me to testify today in support of H.230. We commend the legislature for considering concrete solutions to address Vermont's firearm suicide crisis. Nationally, nearly 60% of all firearm deaths are the result of firearm suicide. But that crisis is even more acute in Vermont, where approximately 90% of gun deaths are the result of firearm suicide. We know that one of the most effective ways to save the life of a person in crisis is to put time and space between that person and access to a firearm, preventing them from acting on a suicidal impulse and making a decision they can never take back. The provisions of H.230 would do just that. And we know that these laws will save lives because studies show that analogous policies in other states are indeed saving lives. 24 states and DC have some form of firearm storage law, including every other state in New England, which I know you've heard many times already. And indeed, that count has changed in the last few weeks from 23 to 24 states after New Mexico's legislature passed and the governor signed a firearm storage bill into law. The number of states with secure storage laws may further increase this year, as Michigan has 2 bills moving through its legislature that would require secure storage of firearms. And there are several states with existing storage laws that have bills moving through their legislatures to strengthen their laws, including the nearby states of Connecticut and Maryland. And we know that these laws will save lives, as research shows that secure storage practices reduce the risk of suicide and unintentional firearm deaths and injuries in youth. As a recently released RAND review found that laws like what's proposed in H.230 reduce self-inflicted intentional and unintentional firearm injuries and deaths among children. I'd like to provide some background information on how H.230 would compare to the other secure storage laws throughout the country. While 24 states and DC have laws requiring secure storage of firearms in certain circumstances, 9 of those states and DC have laws that provide penalties for failing to store a firearm securely, regardless of whether a child or a prohibited person gains access to the firearm. 14 states have laws that only assess penalties if a child or a prohibited person actually gains access to or causes harm with a firearm that was not stored securely. Everytown has a forthcoming report comparing the effectiveness of the various levels of firearm storage laws. And what our researchers found is that compared to states with no secure storage laws, rates of unintentional shootings by children were far lower in the states requiring secure storage anytime the gun is not in the owner's possession. So switching to that level of protection could save countless lives. But among the other categories, rates of shootings are significantly lower in states with laws that apply when a child is likely to access a gun, and in states with laws, what's proposed in H.230, that apply when a child does access a gun, than in states with no secure storage laws at all. Finally, and very importantly, our researchers found that the states with laws that apply only if the gun owner intentionally or recklessly gives a child access to a gun had similar rates of unintentional shooting by children as states without any laws at all. So enacting these kinds of laws are even more important now than ever before. As a recent Pew analysis of the latest CDC statistics revealed, gun deaths among children and teens have risen 50% in just 2 years. H.230 is carefully and narrowly drafted, as it will establish a proactive responsibility for gun owners to lock up their firearms around children and people who are legally prohibited from owning guns, but is very careful in doing so not to over-penalize gun owners for minor violations. H.230 only provides for penalties if unauthorized access and harm actually occurs. This will help to reinforce that responsible gun ownership is a core value for Vermont without overly imposing penalties on gun owners who fail to secure their firearms, unless and until those unsecured weapons are actually accessed by children or a person prohibited from possessing a firearm and used to do harm. Secondly, waiting period laws effectively create a buffer between temporary suicidal ideation and firearm access, which can be the difference between life and death. 9 states and DC have waiting period laws, including the nearby states of Rhode Island and New Jersey. These laws range in length from 3 to 14 days. With the 72-hour waiting period prescribed in this bill, Vermont would have one of the 3 shortest waiting period laws in the country. Several states require buyers to obtain a permit before purchasing a firearm or a handgun. And in these states, the processing time for a permit approval process creates a cooling off period similar to a waiting period for buyers. These states include Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, and Maryland. Waiting period laws are associated with reduced suicide rates. In a study that analyzed the time period between 2013 and 2014, these laws were correlated with a decrease in suicide rates in the states with mandatory waiting period laws, while states without these laws saw an increase in suicide rates over the same time period. Thirdly, 19 states and DC have a law akin to Vermont's extreme risk protection order law. 15 of these laws allow family or household members to directly petition a court to temporarily separate a person in crisis from firearms. Vermont is currently one of only 5 states that does not allow family or household members to directly petition courts. Indeed, these laws have saved lives. After Connecticut increased enforcement of its law, there was an associated 13.7% decrease in the state's firearm suicide rate. Another study estimated that 1 suicide was averted for every 10 to 11 gun removals carried out under the law. Indiana's law was associated with a 7.5% decrease in the state's firearm suicide rate. In several states, just like Vermont, that have existing ERPO laws have expanded eligible petitioners beyond what was initially included when their laws were passed, to include family members, dating partners, or former spouses with children in common, including Connecticut, California, and Illinois. It's a common sense way to ensure that loved ones, who are the most likely to identify early warning signs, have a tool they can use to help save the life of a person in crisis. Since other witnesses have testified before this committee, have raised constitutional concerns, I want to take a moment to reiterate the testimony I provided to the House Judiciary Committee when this bill was under consideration there. In the months since Bruin was decided, we've seen a flood of litigation around the country, but we're still a long way away from seeing whether and if there are splits between circuits, and whether and when the Supreme Court of the United States decides to grant cert to resolve any potential disagreement among the circuit courts on any particular gun violence prevention policy or the proper use of the Bruin test generally. While we believe the majority of gun safety laws will survive these renewed challenges if the new Bruin test is properly applied, until we learn more about how lower courts and ultimately the Supreme Court will give the new test substance and contour, we face a period of uncertainty. We saw the same thing happen after the Heller decision in 2008. And while we think that the Bruin decision was wrongly decided and reckless, the opinion certainly does not stand for the proposition that common sense policies like those contained in H230 must be struck down for violating the Second Amendment. We can't know how long all of this litigation will take, but it's critical that it doesn't deter or intimidate you from carrying on your important work to pass laws you know can keep people safe from gun violence. Indeed, enacting this life-saving legislation and the litigation that will, as always, surely follow, will help put the vital question of their constitutionality before the courts, giving them the chance to assess this carefully crafted language and affirm that common sense gun laws like these are consistent with our nation's history of firearm regulation and not incompatible with the Second Amendment. And the responsibility for that analysis will ultimately be on the judges deciding these cases and the litigators that are challenging and defending the laws. The role of legislators, in contrast, is to pass smart, effective, carefully crafted laws that will save lives. And I think you can all feel confident that the provisions of H230 have been as well drafted as possible in the current landscape to withstand constitutional challenges and are good policy. Lastly, the provisions in H 230 have broad support within Vermont. We have also submitted a letter into the record in support of H 230 signed by 15 organizations representing tens of thousands of medical professionals, educators, public safety advocates, victims of domestic violence, mental health advocates, students, and everyday Vermonters all across the state. Those organizations are the AFT Vermont, the Vermont chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, Everytown for Gun Safety, Leaves of Change Vermont, Giffords, Courage to Fight Gun Violence, Gun Sense Vermont, NAMI, the Vermont Academy of Family Physicians, the Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems, the Vermont Medical Society, Vermont Moms Demand Actions, Vermont Moms Demand Action, Vermont NEA, Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, Vermont Psychiatric Association, and the Vermont Students Demand Action chapter. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify in support of this important legislation that has proven effective across the country and has broad support from stakeholders within Vermont. I'm very grateful for your efforts to address the epidemic of firearm suicide in Vermont in these targeted and highly effective ways. Happy to answer or try to answer any questions you have.
Are there questions for Rebecca Bell? Allison, sorry. All right, any questions for Allison? I thank you so much for your testimony, Allison. I really appreciate it. And we'll continue to work on this bill over the next week and next week. We'll take a notice tomorrow.
Sorry, that's just on the